This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. You're listening to episode 73, Lorenzo Fayne. Centerville, Illinois, was a city on the southeast border of East St. Louis and had a population of 5,000. East St. Louis is a few times larger and has closer to 18,000 residents. As of 2021, Centerville no longer exists and has merged with two other cities out of financial necessity. Centerville and East St. Louis are some of the poorest areas of Illinois. In 2017, the median household income for Centerville was just under $17,500, and the median home value was $48,000. East St. Louis has similar stats. This area was also known as the American Bottom. Raw sewage sometimes seeps through the city streets and homes because of its location on the Mississippi River floodplain. There isn't the money to take care of this problem, or many of the other problems that plague these cities. With a 48% poverty rate, crime is rampant. From 1989 to 1993, there were a record number of murders in East St. Louis, 284. And this was the highest per capita homicide rate in the nation. Centerville logged 29 murders for this same span of years. There was little social cohesion in the community, and most homes had bars on the windows as the only real deterrent for criminals. Local police didn't have the staff to handle the violent crime, as they couldn't even afford to have radios and police cars. When several children were murdered in the small area where Centerville and East St. Louis connected, it wasn't a mystery why they weren't solved quickly. Six-year-old Ari Hunt lived at 217 Elm Street in Centerville, Illinois. He had been playing with his 6-year-old cousin, Devin, when they were approached by a heavy-set black male wearing a red and white striped shirt with blue jeans. The man asked about Ari's brother, 12-year-old Herbert, but the boy said Herbert was at church. The man then offered the boys money if they would follow him. Devin declined, but Ari was interested in the money and walked away with the man. Ari's family realized he was missing and called police just after midnight on July 14, 1989. Police and residents of the area searched the neighborhood around Ari's home. They found his body around 2 a.m. under a bridge along the northern boundary of Frank Holton State Park. He was pronounced dead at 2:50 a.m. by the St. Clair County Deputy Coroner. Ari died from massive blunt trauma, and he had been raped. The coroner couldn't confirm if the sexual assault took place before he was killed. Ari's 37-year-old mother, Desi, last saw her son at 8:30 p.m. Thursday evening, playing with his cousin outside of their house. She reminded the boys to stay close to their yard. Desi crawled into her bed at 9 p.m. because she was a night shift worker employed by Landshire in Belleville. She told her sister to wake her up at 10 p.m. When Desi woke up, Ari was gone. At first, she thought he was with her oldest son, 16-year-old Terrence, but that wasn't the case. Desi started searching for Ari. Devin told the panicked adults that Ari walked away with a man, and they immediately called the police. The family had a theory who the killer was. Since Ari wasn't the type of kid to take candy from or walk off with strangers, they thought it was a 21-year-old man who was known to them and often picked on Ari. Police had several suspects, but would not confirm if their list included this 21-year-old man. They were uncertain if the offender was a stranger or someone Ari was familiar with. A neighbor said Ari was a jolly kid who always smiled. The entire event was jarring, and she would not let her child walk to the store alone again, even though it was only a block from their home. After authorities found Ari's body, the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department received many calls from residents who were concerned for the safety of their children. It was a tough summer for Centerville parents, as another 8-year-old boy was murdered a few weeks later. He was discovered by an abandoned church with his throat slit, and he was stabbed several times. 3 years went by, and Ari's killer had not been caught. In the spring of 1992, a string of child murders happened in a small area close to where Ari Hunt was found. On March 20th, 1992, police found the nude body of 14-year-old Latondra Dean in a bathtub at 422 Circle Drive in East St. Louis, which was the home of one of her friends. They had stabbed her 22 times in the chest. Authorities believed she was attacked in another part of the house, and the struggle ended in the bathroom. Her grandmother said Latondra left to go to the store and never returned. On July 20th, 1992, 9-year-old Fallon Flood left her home around 10:30 a.m. with one of her friends. She was in a supervised recreation and free lunch program held at East St. Louis Senior High School. A black man in a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and black Nikes approached Fallon and her friend. He told Fallon to come with him and told her friend to go away. The friend ran home to tell Fallon's mother what happened. Gloria Flood and a physical education teacher searched the school for the 9-year-old girl. The gym teacher discovered Fallon in the girls' locker room. She was found on the floor by the lockers with a belt tightened around her neck. Her pants were pulled down and her underwear hung around her ankles. Fallon Flood was a member of the R.J. Krause All-Star Club and played both softball and basketball. She always wore a baseball cap. This entire event was troubling to the community. Even in a high-crime city, something this devastating never happened before. The mayor offered a $5,500 reward, which was a large amount of money for the local government to procure. Gloria Flood would eventually sue the high school for $30,000 in damages. The next day, on July 21st, police arrested a 17-year-old cognitively handicapped individual named Charles King. King had been taking part in a summer youth work program that was run by the county. A custodian told police that King was working on the day they found Fallon murdered and had on a white t-shirt and blue jeans. King's family maintained he was innocent and was being set up because he was an easy target. Police took advantage of his diminished mental capacity and after 3 days of interrogation, convinced him to confess to the crime. King was unfit to stand trial for the murder of Fallon Flood. A psychologist determined he could not understand the court proceedings and was not able to help his defense attorney. King's IQ was 57. 69 and below was considered an intellectual disability. His family did not have the financial resources to pay a decent lawyer to defend him. His mother had cerebral palsy, and his father was also mentally limited and had medical issues. A lineup was never done, even though there was at least one witness who saw the perpetrator take Fallon away. Police realized that there was something wrong with Charles King, but ignored it, citing that they were used to seeing people who couldn't read or write, and it didn't mean that the accused was cognitively challenged. They claimed that King knew information that only the killer could have known, but never released the details of King's confession. They charged Charles King with first-degree murder on July 23, 1992, with the bond set at $500,000. On June 25, 1993, 17-year-old Glenda Jones stepped off the bus at 10:50 p.m. after her first day of work training at a summer jobs program. Her mother was worried because she didn't show up at home, so she called the East St. Louis police. Glenda's severely decomposed body was found 300 feet behind Martin Luther King Jr. High School, and someone had stabbed her to death. She left behind a 2-year-old son named Lamar. On July 24, 1993, 17-year-old Faith Davis was found by firefighters inside her burning home at 406 Elm Street. She had been stabbed several times in the back and had been sexually assaulted. There was blood inside and outside of the house. The amount of blood inside the house led investigators to believe that she fought the fight of her life. Faith worked at Burger King, was an excellent student, and enjoyed playing basketball. She was close to graduation and planned on either joining the military or going to college. Authorities used a police dog who followed a trail of blood that led to 409 Elm Street, which was the residence of Lee Fain, who was the aunt of 22-year-old Lorenzo Fayne. He had been a suspect in LaTondra Dean's murder, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. An ambulance driver told police they had just taken a man to St. Mary's Hospital because he had cut his hand on broken glass and needed it stitched. Investigators caught up and arrested Lorenzo Fayne at 420 Elm Street, which was the home of his grandmother. They charged him with burglary and murder. Fain was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he lived with his mother, but sometimes stayed with his grandmother in East St. Louis. He admitted to breaking into Faith's home, but would not admit to killing her. Fain was initially held on a $150,000 bond in the St. Clair County Jail in Belleville for the burglary, and $1 million for the murder of Faith Davis. He was also charged with the murder of Ari Hunt, and that bond was set at $1 million. Later on, the full extent of his crimes would be discovered, and bond was withheld entirely. Investigators matched Fain's thumbprint to one that was found on Ari Hunt's body, so he was quickly connected to that crime. At the time of Ari's murder in 1989, investigators took prints from every man in the neighborhood. 18-year-old Fain had been staying with his grandmother for the summer in East St. Louis and already left Milwaukee by the time police collected prints. On August 18, 1993, the St. Clair County State's Attorney, Robert Hayda, filed a motion to dismiss the murder charges against Charles King in the killing of Fallon Flood. One of the prison employees said he didn't believe that Charles King killed anyone. In jail, King asked when his crayons and coloring books were going to arrive. He didn't understand why he was in jail, away from his family. His mom said that for once, his disability was a blessing. The whole family had to move to Arkansas to escape the angry East St. Louis community because they were being harassed. King's mother, Dorothy, said, "We are grateful for the courage it took to drop this charge. But it would be greater courage still to say he was freed to correct an injustice, to say he was innocent, falsely accused, and wrongly imprisoned." The prosecutor defended the police investigation that led to Charles King being falsely accused and held in prison for over a year. On the day Fallon Flood was murdered, Lorenzo Fayne was mopping the floors at the high school for the county's job training program. He was in the same jobs program as Charles King. By the end of August 1993, Fayne admitted to killing 5 children: 6-year-old Ari Hunt, 14-year-old LaTondra Dean, 9-year-old Fallon Flood, 17-year-old Glenda Jones, and 17-year-old Faith Davis. Fain had either lived or worked within blocks of the locations where the children had been murdered. Investigators were also looking into the 16-year-old Nicole Willis murder. Her body was found on October 4th, 1989, in an empty lot by her house, and was only a block from where Ari Hunt was abducted. Nicole had a 10-minute walk from the bus stop to her house after school. She had been an honor roll student. Nicole was repeatedly hit on the head with a blunt object, was raped, and mutilated with a stick. Investigators were never able to link Fain with her murder. I have 2 dogs and 2 cats. Yes, you heard that correctly. My house is like a pet rescue. But when I have guests over, I don't want my home smelling like it's full of 4-legged friends. This is why I use Scent Air Whisper Home Diffuser. It keeps my home smelling fresh and clean. And the good news is that my listeners can bring professional quality fragrance to all the spaces that matter, from business to home, with Scent Air. Scent Air diffusers are sleek and fill your space with vivid fragrance for up to 300 hours. The Scent Air app lets you schedule your fragrance and control your intensity right from your phone. All of Scent Air's more than 60 fragrances are phthalate-free, cruelty-free, and safe for kids and pets. This winter, try luxury home and fragrance trusted by the pros by going to scentair.com and using the promo code BEYOND for 25% off your first order. That's scentair.com, promo code BEYOND. They initially charged Lorenzo Fayne with 2 murders, and there wasn't a rush to file additional charges. Investigators had him in custody, and this allowed adequate time to conduct investigations. They held Fain in the St. Clair County Jail in Belleville, Illinois. Many of the inmates were from the East St. Louis area, so they moved Fain to Monroe County for his own protection. The prosecutor, Robert Hayda, was seeking the death penalty. Joe Bates was a detective with the Illinois State Police, and he developed a rapport with Fain. Lorenzo Fayne was comfortable with Bates because Bates was that big brother he never had, and he confessed to the 5 murders. Right before Bates took Fain's confession, Fain asked for a lawyer. Bates told Fain that they would appoint him a public defender if he wanted one. Bates said Fain continued with the confessions and never asked for a lawyer. Defense attorney John O'Gara filed a motion to suppress the confessions since he believed that they were illegally obtained. Bates testified that Fain was read his rights and was never threatened or promised anything in return for the confessions. The judge ruled in favor of the prosecution. In September 1993, a grand jury indicted Fain on the first-degree murder of Fallon Flood and Glenda Jones. He would eventually be charged with the 5th murder of LaTondra Dean. They had a lineup for Ari's cousin, Devin. The now 11-year-old saw a man in a striped shirt and blue jeans walk off with Ari on Thursday, July 13, 1989. Devin picked Lorenzo Fayne out of the lineup. The defense attorney, John O'Gara, argued that the lineup was illegally suggestive. There were 6 inmates in the lineup, and Fain, at 6 foot 2 inches and 185 pounds, was 2 inches taller and 15 pounds heavier than the other 5 men. The prosecutor said he picked people who were as similar as possible to Fain. Defense attorney O'Gara wanted all 5 murder cases to be tried in a single trial, which was the opposite of the typical defense strategy. O'Gara wanted to reduce the number of chances that his client had at facing the death penalty, and the prosecutor wanted to increase those chances. The judge ruled Fain would be tried separately for each murder. The defense team convinced the court to allow them to spend up to $2,500 on testing, which could determine if Fain sustained cognitive damage from his childhood. Psychologist Daniel Cuno said that Fain's mother was an alcoholic who physically abused him. Fain was beaten on the head by his mother and other people who took care of him. The psychologist was concerned about Fain having fetal alcohol syndrome. The defense was hoping for evidence that could support an insanity plea. O'Gara filed a motion for a stipulated bench trial where he would present no defense. He offered to promote judicial economy, and the event would be over in 1 hour instead of lasting years on end. If a judge determined Fain was guilty, then a jury would decide on the death penalty, which would only put Fain at risk one time for capital punishment versus having 5 trials and 5 chances to receive the death penalty. Prosecutor Hayda said that he would agree to the single sentencing hearing only if Fain entered a guilty plea to all 5 murders. The prosecutor demanded this because the stipulated bench trials were the equivalent of a no-contest plea. It did not include an admission of guilt. Fain confessed to the murders but refused to plead guilty, so they were at an impasse. Before Fain had his first murder trial, he was civilly sued by a man named Robert Beal, who had been in the Monroe County Jail for writing a bad check. He accused Lorenzo Fayne of brutally beating him on May 11, 1994. Monroe and St. Clair counties were also listed as defendants in the lawsuit. Beal suffered head, eye, and body injuries with cuts and broken bones. The lawsuit states that authorities were negligent by allowing Fayne to mingle with inmates in general population. Monroe County, St. Clair County, and Lorenzo Fayne were being sued for $15,000 each. On August 9, 1994, jury selection began for 23-year-old Lorenzo Fayne's first murder trial of Ari Hunt. The selection process extended into the middle of the week. Fayne's attorney was centering their strategy around his client's brain damage and mental illness and trying to convince the jury that he was insane. There was no question that Lorenzo Fayne murdered 6-year-old Ari Hunt. The defense wasn't disputing that fact. O'Gara told the court that Fayne was a sick and twisted man who killed a little boy because he wanted to hear a neck snap. Fayne was a tortured and insane individual. The prosecutor laid out the evening of July 13, 1989 for the jury. Ari and his cousin Devin were playing in a lot next to Ari's home. Fayne walked up to the children and offered them money. Devin refused, and Ari went. Fayne took Ari to Frank Holden State Park, which was only a handful of blocks away from his house. In a secluded spot underneath the bridge, he repeatedly smashed Ari's head into the concrete structure to such an extent that the pathologists couldn't accurately count the number of fractures. Fayne stripped off the boy's clothing, sodomized him, and tossed his lifeless body down a hillside. Fayne left a fingerprint on the back of Ari's left leg, which connected him to the crime. A variety of people testified, including the crime scene technician, who described finding Ari's shirt turned inside out and soaked in blood. The prosecution had the tech remove the boy's blood-stained shirt and jean shorts from the evidence bag to show the jury. The defense called one witness, which was Fayne's grandmother, Nellie Willis. She said Lorenzo had only lived with her for a few weeks, and he must have been insane to have committed this crime. The judge gave the jury Friday off and didn't want to sequester them over the weekend. On Monday, August 15, 1994, the last witness was Dr. John Raybun, a psychiatrist from the St. Louis State Hospital, who had examined Lorenzo Fayne for 5 hours. He said that Fayne was a classic serial sex killer. Fayne explained to him in detail how he killed each of his victims, then had sex with 4 out of the 5 bodies. He enjoyed inflicting pain because it aroused him. Fayne also enjoyed recounting the stories of the murder and the necrophilia to the doctor. Dr. Raybun explained that Fayne had an antisocial personality disorder manifested by sexual sadism and necrophilia. In his opinion, Fayne was not insane or out of touch with reality, and the issues he had did not fit the definition of mental illness per Illinois state law. Fayne's parents were both alcoholics, and his mother abused drugs like crack cocaine. She continued drinking and using drugs during her pregnancy. Fayne's biological father split when he was 4 and ended up in a VA psych ward diagnosed with schizophrenia. His father regularly beat his mother, and his stepfather did the same thing. Fain spent most of his teenage years rotating in and out of juvenile detention for stealing cars, shoplifting, breaking into houses, abusing animals, exposing himself, and inappropriately grabbing women. He abused substances just like his parents, and his daily consumption included 3 40s and 3 joints. Fain went to prison in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in July 1990 for auto theft. He got out a year later, but was jailed again from November 1991 to January 1992 for disorderly conduct. In jail, they charged him with lewd and lascivious behavior on suspicion of exposing himself to a female employee. Fain had a habit of peeping in windows at women. He enjoyed seeing women undress or people having sex. Dr. Rabin said that Fain enjoyed having sex with his victims after he killed them because they couldn't resist or complain. It gave Fain the control that he desired. In closing arguments, the prosecutor said Fain was not insane or mentally ill, and he had traits that most people found disgusting. Fain was aware of what he was doing when he lured victims to secluded spots and attempted to conceal evidence. The defense attorney said that Fain's brain was flawed, and it explained his mentally ill behavior. Jury deliberation began that evening, and the judge sequestered the jury for that portion of the trial. On Tuesday, August 16, 1994, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the claims of insanity made by the defense and convicted Lorenzo Fayne of the first-degree murder of 6-year-old Ari Hunt. Fayne showed little emotion and had spent much of the trial staring down at the table. The jury was immediately put back to work and entered the death penalty phase of the trial. On Thursday, August 18, 1994, Fayne finally showed emotion and actually wept as his grandmother, Nellie Willis, begged the jurors to spare his life. She said if she knew Lorenzo had been involved in any of the murders, she would have turned him in. Nellie told the jury that her heart ached for the mothers of all the victims. She said that despite his crimes, she still loved her grandson, and if they sent him to prison instead of death row, he could find himself, somehow. The prosecution reminded the jury to not conflate having sympathy for the defendant's family with having sympathy for Fayne. He called Fayne's crimes some of the most disgusting acts that could be perpetrated against humankind. 2 clinical psychologists testified that Fayne suffered from serious brain damage as a child. The defense attorney said after getting to know Lorenzo for the past year, he had seen a different side, capable of emotion. O'Gara said Lorenzo was a throwaway child before he took his first breath. The defense attorney emphasized, but as a people, we don't kill people who are mentally ill. We don't kill someone whose brain is twisted and tortured and damaged. The mercy that I ask you is to allow Judge Donovan to put him with other rapists and murderers in a cell that is smaller than the distance between us. Don't kill him. The stench of death is not answered by more death and killing. Either the defense attorney or Fayne's grandmother persuaded at least one member of the jury, as the vote was 11-1 in favor of the death penalty. After 5 hours of discussions, the 12th juror was steadfast and voted against. It was reported that 11 jurors were angry at the holdout. One juror said that molten lava wasn't as hot as their arguing was. The holdout juror voted against capital punishment because her pastor's son suffered from an ailment which caused him to be violent. When a doctor testified during the trial that Fayne might have that same condition, the juror was not voting for the death penalty. On August 29, 1994, Judge James Donovan sentenced Lorenzo Fayne to life in prison with no chance of parole. Fayne still faced 4 more murder trials and therefore had 4 more chances of receiving the death penalty, if convicted. They sent Lorenzo Fayne to the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, which housed maximum and high-medium security adult male inmates. On January 18, 1995, proving that there was someone for everyone, Lorenzo Fayne found love and married 24-year-old Heidi Matz from Wisconsin. They met through Fayne's brother, Edward, who also lived in Wisconsin. They started as pen pals and talked on the phone. When the media asked Heidi Matz about her relationship, she refused to discuss it. Defense attorney O'Gara tried to fight the additional trials, stating that evidence from all 5 murders was used in Fayne's first trial, which violated the Constitution's prohibition against double jeopardy. But there wasn't a judge or appellate court who agreed with this, and the countdown to 4 more murder trials continued. Fayne's second trial was initially scheduled for fall 1998, but it never took place. It would be a few more years, but the prosecution and defense finally reached a deal. On October 18, 2001, Fayne pleaded guilty to murdering the 4 girls, LaTondra Dean, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, and Faith Davis. And they agreed to have a single sentencing hearing to determine if Fayne would get the death penalty. The prosecution was ready to close all the cases down, since 12 years had passed since the first murder. The jury selection process started on November 5, 2001. 80 potential jurors filled out a 26-page questionnaire. The court even called in an extra 100 jurors in case the lawyers ran through the first 80, with the stakes being so high. On November 9, 2001, 9 women and 3 men were selected for the jury, and the trial began. The jury heard Fayne's 5 confessions and what happened in graphic detail. Fayne choked Fallon Flood and attempted to rape her. He took Glenda Jones by knife point behind the school where they both lived. She convinced him to put away the knife. Glenda agreed to have sex and told him that they could start a relationship. At first, Fayne liked the idea, but then snapped and stabbed her in the chest and raped her. They found Faith Davis face down, bent over a table without her clothes on. She had died in another area of the house, but had been dragged over to the table. Faith had several stab wounds on her chest and back, and her legs were spread apart. Petroleum jelly was smeared on her backside, and she had been sexually assaulted. LaTondra Dean was found nude in a bathtub. She had been stabbed many times in the abdomen and chest. Fayne had raped her. Fayne's sister, 20-year-old LaWanda Dye of East St. Louis, testified about Fayne's abusive upbringing. Their alcoholic stepfather would take Fayne to the basement, where he would tie him up and whip him with an extension cord. Fayne was even beaten until he was unconscious on one occasion. Often, Fayne would be thrown against the wall or tossed across the room. LaWanda said that their mother was on drugs, and Lorenzo would always find something for the kids to eat, since their parents were checked out. Brent Dennis was a social work expert and a professor at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. He had interviewed Fayne several times and believed that Fayne was likely brain damaged while in the womb because his mother was a heavy drinker and drug user. An older neighbor sexually assaulted him when he was 7. When Fayne's stepfather found out, he beat Fayne instead of calling the police. Fayne witnessed his mother being raped at least twice. He started consuming marijuana at age 9 and alcohol at age 11. Fayne was raped at age 10 during his first night in juvenile detention and again at 14 in another juvenile detention center. His mother disciplined him by grabbing the nearest object and smashing it into his head. She believed hitting a child in the head was the proper way to distribute punishment. A child care agency stepped in and had to explain why it was wrong to punish a child that way. Brent Dennis said if someone wanted to produce a killer, they should raise him the way Lorenzo Fayne was raised. Clinical psychologist Daniel Cuno testified that Fayne had the most horrendous family background of anyone he's ever seen in 24 years of his career. He said Fain's IQ was just below a dull normal. The psychologist emphasized Fain was not insane, and his background explained but did not justify the murders. Dr. Jonathan Pincus was a neurologist who taught at Georgetown University and was the chief of neurology at the VA in Washington. He believed that Fain's ability to control violent impulses was affected by brain damage, mental illness, and abuse. Small scars marked his face and head from being hit by his parents. Dr. Michael Gelbort was a clinical neuropsychologist from Chicago and agreed with Dr. Pincus that Fain's brain impairment hindered his self-control. But he reminded the jury that not everyone with brain damage was violent or committed terrible crimes. Records showed Fain could read, and he checked out dozens of books from the prison library. Most were crime, adventure, and suspense novels. Defense attorney John O'Gara argued for mercy based on Fain's horrendous childhood. He said, "There isn't any doubt that this man is brain damaged, mentally ill, and mildly mentally retarded. As a people, we don't execute people who are mentally ill, retarded, and brain damaged. The Nazis did. Stalin did, but not in the United States of America." The prosecutor reminded the jury that even the experts who testified for the defense said that most victims who are abused don't commit horrendous crimes. On November 15, 2001, after 3 hours of deliberation, all 12 members of the jury decided that Lorenzo Fayne should be executed for killing LaTondra Dean, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, and Faith Davis. George Ryan was the governor of Illinois and had always been a strong supporter of the death penalty because he believed it deterred crime. The governor witnessed the near execution of Anthony Porter, who was wrongfully convicted for a double murder and was exonerated 48 hours prior to his execution. On January 11, 2003, during his remaining hours in office, the governor commuted the sentences of 167 inmates who were on death row. 4 individuals were pardoned. Governor George Ryan said the men were innocent and confessed to crimes while being tortured by Chicago police. Ryan was concerned about his state's poor track record, with 19 people exonerated from death row and 12 executed. George Ryan said those outcomes were bad, even for the government. Several years later, in 2011, Governor Pat Quinn signed in legislation that abolished the death penalty in that state. In 2009, they charged Lorenzo Fayne with first-degree intentional homicide of Rita Scott of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 32-year-old Rita Scott was the mother of 3 boys, ages 11, 5, and 11 months. Milwaukee PD's homicide cold case unit was running searches of DNA from cold cases versus a national DNA bank. On September 25, 1989, Rita's partially nude body was found in a pool of blood close to a loading dock of the Jackson Printing Company on the 1500 block of West Cherry Street in Milwaukee. If you aren't familiar with the city, this was close to Marquette University, which can be a very rough area. Rita's head was smashed, and she had been sexually assaulted. She was discovered at 6:45 a.m. by an employee of the printing company. Fain grew up on the 2400 block of West Lloyd Street in Midtown Milwaukee, which was an area plagued by high crime and was close in proximity to where Rita was found. Fain killed Rita Scott 2 months after he killed Ari Hunt. Investigators visited Fain in prison, and he confessed to the crime. He didn't remember the date, but he remembered what happened. Fain came up on Rita Scott and surprised her as he bashed her head in with a piece of cement. He used so much force that the cement broke into pieces. Fain dragged her body between a factory and someone's home. He continued to beat Rita and had sex with her after she passed away. Mozilla Scott, Rita's 71-year-old mother, said her faith in God was how she got through 2 decades of knowing her daughter's killer was free in society. She took in Rita's 3 sons and raised the children as her own. Rita Scott's uncle, Mike Mitchell, said his family remained hopeful that Rita's killer would be found. We never gave up, but life went on. We said God would handle it, and that He did. There's never closure, but there is peace within the family. We all know that Fain will never get out to do this to anyone else. Lorenzo Fayne remains incarcerated at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and sound design were performed by me, Renee. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you so much, everyone.